IPPR and EnBW event on how to win the argument on net zero in a populist era. So the political consensus on net zero has fractured, with clear divided lines between the parties. Right-wing populists are attacking net zero, suggesting policies will make people colder and poorer, that it's motivated by zealotry, driven by an out-of-touch elite. And we hear these assertions made not just by politicians, but also parts of the press. This event will explore the new political landscape for net zero in the UK and how progressives should respond to these attacks. My name is Chase. I'm Head of Citizens Engagement at IPPR, the Institute of Public Policy Research, and I'll be chairing the event this morning. I'm joined by an absolutely fantastic expert panel. So to my right, we have McCluskey MP, who's Minister for Energy and Consumers in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Martin joined the department in September, having previously held the position of Assistant Whip, and he is the MP for Inverclyde and Renfrewshire West. We also have Steve Akehurst, who is Director of Persuasion UK, where he leads research on voter attitudes and political communication. And Megan Scott, who's Deputy Director of the Labour Climate and Environment Forum, and previously worked at Greenpeace. And we have, last but not least, Damien Zachlod, who is Managing Director of EnBW Generation UK and is responsible for the British operations for one of Europe's largest energy companies. So we'll come to our panel for some opening introductory remarks on this topic. We'll hear from all of them, then we'll move on to a Q&A, or we'll have a chance for you to ask your questions of the panel, and we'll close the event at 10:15. I know the Minister has to leave a little earlier than that, so I'll come to him for closing remarks before he needs to go, but we'll carry on a little bit after he's left. So that's all from me for the moment. I will hand over to Martin to kick us off.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm seeing familiar faces in every event I'm doing, so I hope people aren't bored by listening to me make the same points. But I think the point of a politician on any panel is to keep reinforcing the same points over and over again. I'll just say three things very briefly. A little bit about the politics of the situation that we find ourselves in, a little bit about the Warm Homes Plan, because that is right in my brief, and I think it's quite important to building consent around what we're talking about, and then a little bit about some of the piece around consumer protection, which I know is adjacent to a lot of what we're talking about today, but I think when we are thinking about how we continue to build consent and build support for this agenda, we need to have that in mind. I think we have to be really clear about the choices that the government has made. We are in a really good situation in terms of having a Clean Power by 2030 pledge, the energy mission. This is all really good stuff that I know many people in this room will have campaigned for and have advocated for years. We're only here because of choices that we've made. So largely, the choices that were made by Ed Miliband and by the Prime Minister today are central to the government's agenda and to have it flow through everything that we're doing. And while we might just be into the second year and just into this phase of delivery that the Prime Minister has kind of set us out on, we have to really think about the achievements over the past year as well. Great British Energy established, rooftop solar on schools and hospitals, 150,000 homes upgraded over the past year, doubling the rate of home upgrades. The biggest investment in clean energy that we've seen in a generation, and more to come. And I know how much private investors and others have in the pipeline ready to go. But none of this has happened by chance. These kind of choices don't happen by chance. It has been a concerted choice by government to take this central to our agenda. But the thing about political choices is that they can also cut the other way. And what we're seeing now is a threat on this whole agenda from reform. And one of the questions that is in the key questions to consider document that we've been handed in the briefing for this event is what's the role of business and NGOs in taking this forward. And I want to say something briefly about the political challenge to business. We've seen what happened with Clean Power in the US over the last period of time, which is programmes that had been consented being removed, and particularly to wind. Now, obviously, this is the decision to remove the ban on onshore wind. That was one of the very first things that we did, and again, that was a political choice. But we've seen in the address what can happen when politics changes. And I think we need to be serious and take seriously what Reform are saying about what they would do if they came into power. And I think sometimes there is a reluctance, and I understand it because businesses aren't there to get engaged in politics, but sometimes there is a reluctance to make the argument. And we've seen that in political campaigns over the past 15 years. And I think that when they are coming directly for this agenda, it is essential that all of us who have an interest in it, whether we are campaigners, whether we work for NGOs, whether we're politicians or business leaders, speak up and make the argument for why this is so important, and not just important for the bottom line of companies, but important for the climate crisis, important for the environment, important for everything that we're trying to achieve. So that's just a little bit of the politics. But the Warm Homes Plan, I am so excited to have this as part of my portfolio. £13.2 billion for upgrading up to 5 million homes between now and 2031. It's going to be a sea change in terms of what we can achieve. And I put this in the same kind of category, and I think those of us in the room who are Labour Party activists, I put this in the same category as things like the generational changes that happened with things like the Wheatley Housing Act in the 1920s. So for those of you who don't know, the 1920s Wheatley Housing Act built 500,000 social homes across the country. We are upgrading 5 million homes. So this is a Labour agenda, it's a distinctly Labour agenda to ensure that people have warm homes that are properly insulated, that aren't damp, that aren't squalid, that have clean and healthy air inside them. And if that's not something that we can get behind, I'm not quite sure what the Labour agenda in this area is that we can get behind. So a really important step change, because we know that buildings are providing about 30% of direct emissions, and we know that the housing stock that we've got is incredibly old, and it's going to be a challenge to upgrade it. And that's why this is so important, because all of these, I was thinking about a wind turbine picture behind me, but imagine a wind turbine. These things might affect some communities, but the things that are really going to bring this whole agenda home to people is the stuff that they're going to find in their own houses, whether that's what we're doing on heat pumps, or whether that's what we're doing in terms of insulation, or any of the other measures that people might have in their homes. And just one very final point, again, adjacent to some of this agenda, but I have been boring on about this all week, and I think it's just really important to make the point that there's so many people in the room who have an influence in this. We need to make sure that the consumer offer is robust, and that people are able to have confidence when they are making decisions about how they change their behaviours and their homes and how they engage with the energy market. And at the moment, there is still a bit of a perception that this is a kind of Wild West where there's not a lot of confidence in terms of installing measures, and then in terms of making sure that people have confidence if something goes wrong. So we absolutely need to make sure that we deal with the cost barrier in terms of people upgrading their homes, but we also need to make sure that we deal with the confidence barrier. And by that, I mean making sure that people have robust offers from suppliers and installers, that they know that they're asking people into their homes to make these changes, that they are going to be done reliably, and then afterwards, that, as I said, if something goes wrong, that they're able to get some form of redress. And on top of all of this, and we'll probably come to this in the discussion, we need to make sure that we're having a proper discussion about the impact on bills. And as Minister for Energy and Consumers, you won't be surprised to hear that the one kind of direction that I was given when I took this job was we need to work out how we actually bring bills down while maintaining our commitment to the agenda that we set out in the Clean Power Mission. So that is as I see it, the kind of landscape in terms of the political challenge we face, but also in terms of the challenge that I face in my brief with Warm Homes Plan and with the cost of energy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. We'll come to Steve next.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, from Martin to imagine a wind farm, or to imagine a graph. On this axis, I'm not I won't put that through that. So I do lots of polling and podcast. Used to work in that I have done for 3 or 4 years now. It's a very strange life that I lead, but it does give a position from which to say, okay, here's what I think is changing public opinion in the data. And it's worth starting there with what the actual facts are. The public opinion there will shock you to that quite a lot of bollocks talked in the media and especially on Twitter about voter opinion on climate. And if you are in the kind of echo chamber of X or Westminster generally, you will probably have seen the kind of performance theatre of like roiling, angry, anti-net zero, I hate Greta, wind farms make you gay, all of that kind of stuff over the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm not here to say that has had no effect on public opinion, but the effect on public opinion is not as much as you would think. Right? So when you think about public opinion, it's worth thinking of it on 2 basic axes, 2 genders, as I would say, which is like sympathy and salience. Okay, so sympathy is how much you care about. So sympathy is what you think about net zero or climate and energy policy when I ask you your opinion, and then salience is, well, how much do you care about that opinion compared to every other opinion? Okay, so on sympathy, we still carry, I would say, 50, 60 more % of voters with us on most sympathy questions, including most kind of, here's our argument, here's the opponent's argument. But what has happened is there's about 25% of voters now who are consistently hostile to net zero and consistently against, but it is about 25%, which is still more than it was, so I'm not here to say that to be complacent, but it is still a fairly small pocket that is very noisy, that consistently hates us kind of reach, basically. But the good news for Labour is almost none of these people are inside their electoral coalition. Okay, they are largely Tory to Reform switchers or the Reform base. The average Labour to Reform switcher even is like, doesn't care much about net zero, but it's not as hostile, it's not as cranky on the subject. So it's worth bearing that as the electorate balkanises into these different fragments, it's worth being really clear about which bits of the electorate we are talking about and whose electoral coalition we're talking about. So outright hostility to net zero is not really something that is a feature of this government's electoral coalition in any meaningful way. Okay? There are still risks, which we'll come on to, but it's an important point to clarify. The major thing that has happened actually in public opinion is that people care, even the average voter cares about it a lot less. Okay? So, even Greta is now campaigning on other things, like Gaza. So that's a really good point. Even the activist base around climate has sort of dissipated a little bit compared to 2018 and 19. And in general, you see climate change and energy and things like that in the news a lot less. At least from a perspective that might push up salience. So what consequences does this have? Well, if you prioritise an issue less, you may not be hostile to it, but you prioritise it less, you become more sensitive to cost and inconvenience. And you become more sensitive to the arguments that, well, like, this is an important thing to do, but I don't know, let's kick it down the road. And that is kind of a little bit where we're at with like the average voter, particularly the kind of swing voter, let's say, the Labour to Reform switcher is not hostile, they care about it a lot less, they are more susceptible to the argument that this is all just a bit too costly and inconvenient, which again is not the same as the cranky anti-net zero side. And this manifests most on, let's say, to answer one of the questions in the briefing around what impact does this have on policy attitudes, you'll see that lots of specific policies still maintain support, but the policies that have declined in some support are things like transition to EVs, transition to heat pumps, anything that kind of sounds a bit costly and inconvenient. And it doesn't mean that public opinion can't be wide round on those subjects, but it's more sensitive, it's more soft. And so it is worth being really, and Mark has already touched on this, it is worth everyone in the policy space being really, really sensitive to cost and inconvenience. And so if you could make, and I found this when you look at attitudes to EV transition, again, the average voter is not hostile to EVs, they think EVs are a good thing, they are quite open to them. It's really just a practical question of like range and all that stuff. It's not the kind of insane, this is all World Economic Forum conspiracy stuff or whatever you'll see on Twitter. It's like quite good faith concerns about practicality. And that's the kind of thing that will probably decide the fate of net zero with the average voter. Okay, is that kind of quite boring stuff that gets forgotten. So that's where we're at, I guess, in terms of there's a small pocket of voters who are more outright hostile, but for the government's electoral coalition, really the thing is that people just care about it. That's say yes as well. The number of people blaming net zero for rising energy bills is still fairly low. But it is, as I said, it's clearly the cost of living environment and falling issue salience is creating this cost and sensitivity to cost. So from a policy design point of view, I've already said, like extra sensitivity to cost. If you find some money to make things cheaper for people on more frictions, you cannot. That's an essential part of what needs to be done in all of these areas, particularly the consumer-facing ones. I'll just end with what does this mean for NGOs and businesses. I think that's in some ways more important. I will say, if you are concerned that populist right are getting on top of this agenda, I promise you, because I spend every single day looking at message testing this, they do not have better messages than us. They have better infrastructure, and they have better media infrastructure, they have better communication infrastructure. If you put our argument against their argument, pretty much every single time, at least for the majority or plurality of the public, our argument wins. Okay? The trouble is that media debate and public debate is not played out in my surveys or in my little laboratory. Okay? It's played out in an environment in which all of the energy and enthusiasm is on the anti-net zero side. And if you pick up a couple of the Daily Telegraph or you go onto Twitter, you will see it is just a parade of crackers, frankly. A lot of stuff that is like quite bad faith, but it is relentless over and over again. And we, on the climate side, we used to have that energy, and it's gone away. Okay? And it's been replaced, I think, with a lack of confidence to take some of this stuff on. And there's lots of people in this room who have done this. Greenpeace are in the room who did a great job the other day taking on reform around fracking. There are lots of ways in which the anti-net zero side take unpopular positions, take toxic positions, and people don't have the confidence to go into TV studios, to talk to the journalists, to take the fights in the spaces where this stuff matters, which is actually primarily in those kind of elite media spaces. And I think it is having a knock-on effect in terms of the self-confidence of parliamentarians, policymakers, that is way, way beyond where public attitudes actually are on this, and it's creating a distorting effect. It's leaving all of these people to set the terms of debate and to give a distorted impression of where voters actually are. And it is the government's role to take some of that stuff on. I think Ed Milman's business do a great job of it. I'd like to see a bit more of it from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor as well. But I think the government has got a lot on its plate. It is also for the sector to, as far as they can within the bounds of political neutrality, take some of the stuff on, because I promise you we're in the fight of our lives here, and you do not want to be sitting on the fence, because what could come next would be very unpleasant for everyone. So that would be my final call, is like I promise you the numbers are on our side here, but the media infrastructure is slanted very much towards the direction at the moment, and that is what I need to urgently address through communications infrastructure primarily, and also self-confidence to some degree. So I'll let them.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for the call to action. Megan.
Thank you so much. To be slightly less positive, I agree, of course, that the moment public opinion is still on side, that we shouldn't be as negative as sometimes we currently are. However, I think it is also good to think about where we could end up in 3-4 years' time going into the next general election. I think it is not wrong to say that net zero is the new frontier of the culture war, and think about how it is that we avoid getting into the trenches, as it were. Now, I think the net zero playbook that we're kind of operating in at the moment in the Farage attacks is something that we've seen before. So the reform ideology is actually pretty straightforward. The populist ideology is about a top-down ideology being imposed on the people. Now, we saw this used to great effect with Brexit, which is obviously Farage's original outfit. Undemocratic, unelected bureaucrats in Brussels imposing their ideology, their way of life onto people who have never asked for it, never really voted for it. We actually saw this again with the nationwide scandal a couple of years ago with Farage. The reason why that really took hold was that it was about a simple thing, bank account being denied to somebody because of a top-down liberal ideology being imposed on Nigel Farage, right? It was saying, you can't have this because you don't think and act the way that we want you to. Now, net zero, I think, is in danger of becoming one of these top-down liberal ideologies that, like with the Remain campaign, we say to people, and I say we as industry, NGOs, politicians, people who advocate in this space, we say, well, this has to happen because it's good for you, and we tell people it's good for them without actually working with them. We're not doing the transition with people, but to them, and that's where we get into the danger point where actors like Farage can come in and exploit that kind of anger at people feeling like change is beyond their control. I mean, take back control, it's a slogan, of course, but it also speaks to a wider attitude in this country of people who do feel that politics is done to them a lot of the time. And also, to be frank, I've had a lot of politicians come through the revolving door and say that they're going to be different and simply aren't. And so I think that there's the good news, I will say, is that there's some key things within the Clean Power mission and within this government that I think we can tackle this kind of top-down net zero approach. One I'm really excited about is the community energy and local power plan. I think that is an enormously strong part of the clean energy mission. And I know that Michael Shanks is personally really invested in this as part of Great British Energy. So community energy, and I won't go into it now, but essentially goes into communities, encourages them to basically produce their own energy, take a share in the profits, reinvest those profits into their communities. Energy companies have got like a really bad rap in the last few years. There's some really great ones doing amazing work and investing into communities, but the local power plant encourages communities to own the profits that energy production creates and to reinvest it into things like, for example, if you put solar panels on your local school, you can reinvest those profits back into more teaching, more crayons, more books, whatever you like. I think that's a great way to not only bring kind of wealth creation into local communities, but also, crucially, to make the kind of the tangible energy transition there for people to kind of interact with, and I'm very passionate about it. I would also say that the national shared mission of clean energy, I think that we did so well, and I say we there as a sort of Labour Party person, we did so well during the campaign. Great British Energy, it feels national, it feels like people share in it, people feel like it's you know, kind of like wartime cry. We need to keep doing that in government. We need to keep saying to people, please be a part of this with us. We're moving towards energy security, we're getting Putin to boot off our neck. Like, these are really strong messages that people really want to be a part of something, and we need to keep saying that to them, that this is like a shared societal effort, not something that's imposed from Whitehall. Secondly, I think also people have to see the proof when it comes to the energy transition. I'm really excited about the Warm Homes Plan for this reason. I think that, to be blunt, like, we could do clean power by 2030, and people would notice, hopefully, coming down in their bills, but they'd also notice basically quite a lot of pylons, quite a lot of national grid upgrade, maybe not that much else, and it doesn't feel, again, tangible. You know, the energy production, people aren't policy experts, you speak to them on the door, it doesn't really mean anything to them, whereas actually you talk to people about insulation, you talk to people about damp and leaky homes, and the fact that actually people put their radiators on and half of it goes through the windows and half of it goes through their doors, and this Labour government wants to change that, and people really get that, they understand it. So I think there's a thing about meeting people where they're at, which is really important, and the Warm Homes Plan, again, I think is a proof point over the next 4 years that we should be absolutely shouting about from the rooftops. And finally, to answer a different question on these key questions to consider, there's a question here that says, what, if anything, can progressives learn from populism? And I say, well, actually, I'd like to see a Labour government mount a more robust defence of the populist critique that it is kind of us v them, elites in Whitehall versus everybody else on the ground. And as I've talked about, you know, you absolutely do have to meet people where they're at. Something that I really don't like about the climate and nature debate in government is the builders versus blockers. I think it's phenomenally unhelpful. When people talk about blockers, they're literally talking about their own voters a lot of the time. And I think that if a government is turning around to people on the ground and saying, you are a blocker, that reinforces a populist narrative of, we're going to impose this on you, this is going to be done to you. I'd like us to move away from that language. I'd like us to stop slagging off regulators. Reform is going to be slagging off the state quite a lot, and actually we should be defending the state and the institutions and the arms of the state and saying, we know they're not perfect, but they're there for a reason, this is the work that they do, and actually state power is good. You know, we're in a situation where Reform are determined to dismantle quite a lot of what is state scaffolding that has been built, and actually as the party of government now, we have to be defending that. So that's a call to action a little from a Labour government. And finally, I'm just going to end on something that Ed Miliband said at an LSF event on Sunday, and apologies for the language, but I am directly quoting, where he said, what is the fucking point of being in politics if not to argue for your ideals? And actually, we need to stop being embarrassed about being, you know, some of us middle-class lefties who believe that the climate crisis is here and it's happening and that we need to act on it, and we need to be a little bit more full-throated and going out and making the case. And I agree with Steve that the public is still on our side. We need to improve our communications infrastructure, but also we need to start saying some of these things with our chest, because God knows Reform are. Thank you.
quite the act to follow. Well, I apologise in advance. So I represent EnBW, I'm Managing Director here in the UK. So EnBW is the last remaining fully integrated state-owned utility in Germany. So we run everything from transmissions right through to customer business. But here in the UK, we're a pure play offshore wind developer. And we're developing 3 projects, known as Morgan and Morgan. This is about 6 gigawatts of installed capacity, or to speak in a better language, enough power for 6.2 billion homes when everything's been built. So that's where we sort of come from. And I think first thing to start from here, from the business perspective, I agree, net zero starts to become the next culture war. But I think if we look at where we are today, some 3.5 years out from an election, we have a hugely supportive government. The Clean Power 2030 mission, we know it's an ambition, and whether we hit everything, let's see. But this kind of objective really resonates with business. The engagement that we get from DESNZ and both politicians and civil servants is extremely strong. So I would say we're going in the right direction. We can achieve this. I think if we look here, I think what's happened historically is when the Climate Change Act came through, this meant that everybody got behind the climate part of the argument for repowering the UK, and we let that do the heavy lifting. And I think, really speaking, from an industry perspective, what we need to do now is, as this gets challenged, we need to start talking about the other benefits of what happens when we make these investments. And this is jobs, this is local supply chains, this is increased energy security, this is delinking from volatile fossil fuel pricing in our markets. So I think all of these things do resonate, or can resonate, on the doorstep if we can get this right. So I genuinely look at this as a real opportunity, and I think, just to put a bit more context on this, that DESNZ follows general support for renewable energy, and I think what we've seen, we still have 80% support across the board for renewable energy. This has fallen from, it was 88% at its highest point back in 2022, but this is still the overwhelming majority of people believe in renewable energy. Offshore wind individually has generated 17% of the UK's electricity last year. So it's happening. It's happening already. We're doing this. We're creating leadership. This is a success, this industry, and we should really consider that net zero is a success. And I agree, we need to find a way to get there. And that's really now about moving to practical stories. In the conversations we have with government, they're quite clear. They're asking industry to say, well, come and talk about the jobs that we're creating. Come and talk about the impacts that we're having. And I think this is the key part where industry needs to lean into this and start supporting with actual facts on the ground. I think that my call to action here is we need to stick with the Clean Power mission, and I think generally what we need to come together across the different stakeholders, NGOs, industry, government, we need to now start looking at this as it's a national mission. We need to keep this national mission, and different people are taking different things from it. I think we've only spoken about the climate story, as I've said before, and what we need to do now is move beyond the climate story. We need to start talking a lot about jobs and investment and that real impact on communities. I think if we look at areas, reform is succeeding in areas with lots of offshore wind jobs. So I think if reform starts tearing up CFDs and all of these sort of extreme policy positions they're taking, they are going to destroy jobs in their own areas. And last time I looked, that's not the way to win an election. So I think there's a lot of areas here where we just need to be a bit more thoughtful, and I think who doesn't agree with let's stop buying gas from Vladimir Putin. That's what offshore wind and renewable energy will allow us to do. So I think there's some areas here where if we get the comms right, it can be really powerful, and it's about understanding that it doesn't need to be the same message all the time. I think we sort of try to bang one drum and it's good for you. But we need to make this more nuanced because different people are looking for different aspects in this. And I think that's a challenge we need to work together on. I think my final comment is just, I think no one wins if we allow critical infrastructure to become a culture war.
I'm going to use chess problems to just ask one question because I feel like there's an interesting, and I don't think it is a tight on the panel, but I think there's sort of lots of positions people are taking around that question of talking more or talking less about climate. Who's doing that talking? So which messages, to whom and from whom? I suppose that question of more or less, and it'd be interesting to hear the different perspectives. No,
Okay, I'll
you're
keep
going to
it
start
fine.
because I'm coming to you
I know
first.
it's like because I have many thoughts. I'm like,
Yeah.
how do I keep this concise so people
Yeah, keep it
I'm
concise.
not crying. Alright, so in message testing, it's very clear. But the answer to this question is always, what are you trying to do? What is your objective with public opinion? Or who are you trying to convince? If you're trying to drive up the salience of climate change, people still don't believe me, but it is true. In every single experiment, message testing experiment you do, talking to people about climate impacts and their kids and future generations, that is the stuff that drives up the salience of climate change, which is the thing that we have lost in the last 5 years. But if what you're not trying to do that, because you can't do it, or that's not really to your objective, and you're trying to sell this particular policy around the transition to renewable energy, then actually, yeah, the climate message can work, but it's energy independence message works the best, right? Because people have a sense that the Brits are in control of its energy supply, and that has an impact on stability of bills. The energy bill stuff, we'll take through affordable bills, or we're going to create millions of new jobs. I think, to Damien's point, when those jobs exist, or when the bills have come down, then that's a more credible story. But as a kind of jam tomorrow thing, it doesn't work quite as well as people think it does. So, yes, I think if what you're trying to do is drive up climate savings, yes, talk more about climate. If you're trying to sell net zero and clean energy policy, particularly in a kind of an elite space, then energy independence, hopefully that's a success.
So thank you very much, Steve. Martin, what do you for any reflections on that question, but also reflections on the other comments on this?
So there's a lot I could say, because I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I think on that question of more or less, I would agree with what Steve said. It depends on what the objective is, depends what you want to drive up. And from my point of view, as the minister responsible for something like the Warm Homes Plan, I want certain pedestrians to help us deliver what we say we're going to deliver by 2030. It's as simple as that. Tell us what the best messages are. But I think in thinking about something like home insulation and heat pumps, the best example is what people see their neighbours doing. So and there's a way that we can design the policies in terms of spatially designed policies to make sure that streets are getting upgraded at once and estates are getting upgraded at once, so that people can see their neighbours benefiting from it. I'll give you one example of this. So I grew up in a 4-in-a-block ex-council house that my grandparents moved into in the 50s, so kind of 1930s housing stock. About 10 years, so my mum lived in it until about 2 years ago. About 3-4, around about the time of COVID, there was an insulation programme offered for the whole street and all the streets around it. And the vast majority of people, even the kind of owner occupiers, paid in to get their homes upgraded. There was one woman who refused to upgrade her home and went into the local paper. We have the benefit of having, the great benefit, I would say, of having a daily local newspaper for 2 small towns. So went into the local paper and said, I am not having this forced upon me. And within 2 years, she'd upgraded her home. Because every single one of her neighbours, and I don't know her reasoning for it, but what I would imagine is every single one of her neighbours did it, probably heard how much their heating bills have gone down by, because I know how much my mum's heating bills went down by, and saw the advantage of it. So, to Megan's point about kind of like lefty liberal middle class arguments, it's like, we need to make the lefty liberal middle class argument sometimes, but actually the best thing to do is to sometimes just step back and let people talk to each other. But we need to design the policies in such a way that that we achieve those outcomes. Just one other thing on kind of populism, what we can learn from populism. I know it's really it's kind of cliched almost now to say we need better stories. But we do need better stories, and that kind of links into what I've just said there. But an example that we give of that is, in the Scottish context, there is obviously a lot of concern, a lot of stories around oil and gas, and people are right to raise the issues with transition away from oil and gas in the North Sea, because it will have an impact. But Scotland also has like a really proud history before oil and gas of hydro. So we were literally tunnelling into mountains to build power stations in the 50s and 60s, and this is infrastructure we're still relying on now. But that story is not as much of, you think of Scotland, you think of energy, you think of oil and gas. you aren't thinking about hydro, you're not thinking about the really big ambitious programmes that Tom Johnson ran as Secretary of State for Scotland in the 40s and 50s. So it's, those stories are there for us to take and start to run with. So we really need to start talking about those sort of things more. And I think that, again, a challenge for us as politicians, a challenge for activists, but also a challenge for business. And actually some of the energy producers in Scotland have done a lot of work trying to tell those stories. I think they will become increasingly important to say this isn't something that's kind of out there and foreign, but this is something that's been kind of fundamental to the way our country has generated energy for decades and decades.
I'm conscious that it's a few minutes, I make it just. Did you have anything else you wanted to close on? Yeah.
I'm happy to. I'll do the main numbers.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think let's see if we can get a minute question for you then. So I'm going to take, I'll take 3 questions at a time, and if you could, there's a lady just directly to your right there.
Hi, it's Louise Hutchins from the Make Polluters Pay Coalition. Isn't one of the big elephants in the room the question about who pays for the climate action? Reform and the Tories are not shy about this. They say we shouldn't be doing climate action because we can't afford it. And Steve's like saying in the polls, people are worried about that. And people are worried because generally they do get asked to pay for stuff, don't they? They know that the economy generally is not serving them very well. Huge cost of living crisis. And the other thing that comes out in the polls, Steve will probably know this very well, is there's quite a lot of anger about the amount of money going to very rich corporations, the sense of being ripped off. And so is there something about the government swinging behind a little bit more the idea that comes up in the polls time and time again? 7 out of 10 people think that the big oil and gas corporations that have made billions over years should be paying more for this. And there was a poll just yesterday, and you get a poll saying that 75% of people think that big corporations should be paying more for this. Isn't that part of the answer?
Okay, we'll take another in the yellow tie, and then green top directly.
Bob Wall from the LSE. Can I ask Steve just about the separation you made between climate change and net zero? Isn't that part of the problem? I mean, we don't have usually the messaging around the fact that the reason we're doing net zero is to stop climate change happening locally. And I feel part of the problem here is we've got 2 government departments. One deals with climate change impacts, one DESNZ. DESNZ rarely talks about it, about the reason for net zero, and the opposition never talk about climate change because they know that people actually want to stop it.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, so in a now Reform Council area. When we're talking and listening to our Reform councillors, they're very against net zero as a thing. They're very against sustainable development goals, and their narrative is all about how do we stop government imposing charges on our population for wind farms that won't pay back for 30 years, etc. But when we're talking to them about low carbon tech and the fact that can generate new jobs locally, that's really positive. The businesses, it's all about how do they actually make it higher up their priority list. How do you point out how it costs them something, and if we get a government grant or subsidy, it can save them money and help them get into supply chains. How can we actually get governments to have a business support policy to drive the businesses in the right direction? Because at the moment there doesn't feel like there's any help to do that.
Thank you very much. So a question on who pays, a question on that climate net zero distinction, and a question on sort of business support. Love to think to you first.
Yeah, I think on Miranda's question, like there is no low carbon tech without the whole infrastructure around it, because the market needs a signal as to what we need to build. And so I think that that's again a duty on us to be helping to make those arguments. And I think this takes us to Louise's question about who pays. I would push back gently on, like, in terms of action on making oil and gas producers pay. We obviously took action on EPL. We came in to government last year. But I am gripped by the fact that we need to work out how to make this cheaper and more attractive to people. So the point is not lost, but I think just bear in mind we did take action when we came in. Like, I think we've also seen the political salience, specifically with something like heat pumps. I was having a conversation with someone last night about the German devolved elections and the AfD's campaign, which was largely built around heat pumps. So we can see how the right will do exactly what you're saying and grab this agenda in order to push their own kind of ends.
Question was direct specifically to you, there, Steve. So.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. I basically agree with you that you will always need it when you're talking to voters or anything. The big why. Okay, I talk about this very a lot. Why are we doing any of this stuff? Because most people don't pay that much attention, and sometimes a lot of things government does or policymakers do just a bit random, and that's a really bad thing. So you do need a consistent story of why you're doing this. I do think energy independence can be that story, and people do intuitively understand it as the big why. But for sure, yeah, the climate kind of why is an important one, and it has been lost a bit. So I agree with you on that. I understand why government has done that, but partly because the government is operating in has to have put its own internal coalition together a little bit, and I think it's easier to sell other messages to other internal stakeholders and all the rest of it. So I understand I'm clearly nervous about doing a climate message most of the time, and I think that's partly to do with elite dynamics and stuff like that. And so I don't think it's completely reasonable to expect the government, also when it's just trying to sell the policies it has, to constantly bang the drum around climate. I do think that there is an obligation for some other parts of the media infrastructure to do that, and by I mean the campaigning infrastructure to do that. Ideally, you want, an energy independent story can be useful in some context, but ideally, the big strategic challenge is that the salience of climate change is falling off the agenda, and the single most useful thing for all net zero policy would be for climate energy to come back up public's list of concerns, but that is really about climate change and energy. Climate change in particular being used more, and that requires some part of the climate movement, I think, to try and get back to talking about this is why we're doing this. I don't think it's fair to expect government to do that all day or pull out, but I do worry a bit that everyone has rushed to kind of co-benefit narratives, and a lot of NGOs are not. They don't necessarily see it as their role to raise the salience of climate with voters. That's not really what they're there to do. So I think we have a missing piece in our infrastructure, basically, that if there are any funders in the room, it's worth investing in. There are great organisations like Round Our Way who exist to sell that story of this is why we're doing this, really looking to the future, etc. But they are still quite small when they don't receive anywhere near as much money as an NGO doing a policy report. So yeah, I agree. I think it's a missing piece of our infrastructure. I would just say I don't think it's all the wrong government in that.
Can I just take on the business support question? So just to answer around business support being available in the offshore wind industry, as OIC and Renewable UK, the trade body, we've actually come together to do a piece of analysis called the Industrial Growth Plan. And this was a very specific document looking at supply chain opportunities in offshore wind, mapped against the skill sets that are available already in British industry. So I'd really recommend you take a look at this. It's by a piece of work right now where the government has announced 300 million of support, Crown Estate 400 million, and industry will match with 300 million. So there's around $1 billion being developed to support UK businesses to come into the offshore wind supply chain. So I really think that's an area where I'd recommend you have a look. It sort of fits as part of the broader industrial strategy work. If you grab me afterwards, I can send you the report.
Any thoughts from you?
Sure, I think I'll just pick up on the Make Police Pay question. So I think, first of all, an enormous credit to NGOs, Make Police Pay, Greenpeace in the room, former colleagues who really upped the salience of just how much profit oil and gas companies were making. I think that, for me, NGOs make the weather, or can make the weather, that politicians operate in. Enormous power to harness public anger, to direct it towards something. I don't think that without phenomenal campaigning work that we would have had Labour talk about windfall tax, which the Tories then nicked and kind of halved it, and then, as Martin said, strengthened in the EPL last budget. I also think, for me, we're not going to deliver an energy transition without all of these big companies. It has to be a joint effort, and I do think that I am slightly wary of creating a kind of singular enemy within any kind of conversation around an energy transition, to be honest, when we know that actually everybody has to pull together towards the same goal. Now, government's responsibility is to ensure that everybody is pulling towards that goal effectively, and again, NGO's responsibility is to campaign, but I think on a kind of polluter pays principle, I absolutely agree, but I also go, for me, the more powerful narrative, rather than a kind of like creating a sort of binary campaign, is this national shared mission where everybody's pulling together. And that's what I'd like to see a little bit more from government, whilst of course like amazing campaigns like Make Polluter Pay will continue to advocate for that principle and make that weapon. So, and just to say, that work doesn't go unnoticed, I think, or unrecognised.
Thank you very much for joining us. We'll take 3 more questions. So, everyone, if you come down this way. There's one hand there, just keep your, that one, yeah.
Hi, Stephanie with Carbon Balance. We've been talking a lot about reform, which makes a lot of sense. I completely understand why. I'd be curious to understand the panel's take on the Green Party's recent sort of trying to capture this conversation with the Zachlod sees eco-populism and what that. It's an open-ended question, but what is your take on that? Is it a positive development? How do you think that's going to impact Labour's response, or is there nervousness, or is there something negative that you think we should be aware of?
Thank you. If you could have the director's present point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard McCluskey, I'm the chair of the Smart Meters Data. In terms of the populism point, I'm baffled why government, and indeed the panel, slightly has a throwaway remark. It took until Damien to mention security, and then you converted that, Steve, to independence, which I thought was smart. I think there's a much more, there's a populist argument to win, which is we're generating, resourcing our own energy solutions. And the important thing about fossil fuels, apart from, of course, climate change issues, is those resources are finite. Sun and wind, as far as I know, we're going to continue forever. So we could be our own country generating, and it's going to last. I think there's a much more stronger populist argument to be won. We even have the department called Energy Security and Net Zero. I would not bury net zero, I would be calling it the clean and secure plan. I'd be thinking about playing that much harder before someone else does, and it looks like Labour's chasing the story rather than leading it.
Okay, and just directly to you. Oh, sorry, sorry. Sorry. Yes.
Hi, Helen from Carbon Trust. I wanted to ask panelists about the term net zero. I've been in this field for nearly 25 years and I've seen the language come and go and different labels. I have to say that personally, net zero is my least favourite because it's the least intuitive, I feel, the language has ever been. Chris Stark was briefly our CEO last year. One of the first things he said to us was that he would be very comfortable with moving away from that language. So I wondered what you thought, maybe particularly Steve, if it's something that you have looked at in your work.
Brilliant. So we have a question on Green Party and eco-populism, one on that emphasis on security and independence, and one on the question mark over that term of net zero. Perhaps, Dave, if I come to you first for your reflections, both on sort of on that sort of maybe security, independence type bit, but also independence.
No, I think that's the one best place to stop the politics I'm here for. So I think actually it's a really good idea and it's a really good point to sharpen that messaging and be a bit clearer on that. I think you're quite right to talk about the finite nature of oil and gas. It's being played as let's drill baby drill, as if we have infinite supplies in the North Sea and we can feed our own internal energy market. And we all know that's not true. So the oil and gas is left there is still some, but it's to extract. It's the more difficult sites, and I think it's fine in the context of the just transition that Martin sort of alluded to, in the context of jobs. That I'm not gas, and again, we need to use the energy sources that we have. So I'm not in a short term get rid of the jobs, because there is a difficult story here, which is as oil and gas comes down, it takes a little while before renewable energy jobs are coming up. And we need to find a way to balance that realistically for all the communities that will be affected. So it's not as easy as just one message, but your point around clean and secure or the energy independence piece. I think this is absolutely key, and I think you're right, if we don't make that argument enough.
Thank you. Okay, can I come to you? I think I think primarily on the kind of eco-populism question, if that's okay, but you feel free to.
Yes, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that the Green Party eco-populist one is interesting. I think it speaks to, I think for me there is a kind of sort of Jeremy